Kenyon Martin throws it down. Oh, my Lord.
The Detroit Pistons select Luke Kennard from Duke University.
Bang! Samaje Christian, 3.
Welcome, folks. Another episode of the Triple Double Podcast. This is a special episode. As all of you undoubtedly know, if you are a basketball junkie and listen to this, we are ready to hit the July evaluation period, meaning there are 3 5-day periods, a total of a 15-day grind, where NCAA Division I schools are going to be able to go out on the road, evaluate AAU tournaments and some camps, watch all the players that they want to recruit, and continue the evaluation process and recruiting process. So for this episode, we do not have a guest. We're just going to try and hit a few talking points. Jason Moore, our producer's here, and we're going to talk about what July is and what to look for from whatever perspective you're in. So let's start with players. And when we talk about players, what do you want to focus on when you get ready to play in July? So when I've got guys on the AAU circuit, coaching with the Cincinnati Lakers and then coaching before that, or kind of playing in a GM role before that, is I want to tell my guys the number one thing as a scout, as someone who's been doing the scouting service thing for almost a decade now, the number one tip for July for me is play to your strengths. And what does that mean? That means if you are a 6'7" athlete, and you can play with a lot of energy and you can rebound and protect the rim, but you're not a great three-point shooter, that's fine. Do that. Worry about defense. Worry about finishing around the basket. Worrying about being that energetic person. Don't worry about shooting threes. I want you, if I'm your coach, to show me what your strengths are more so than expose your own weaknesses. And you can do a lot more negative than you can positive by going out there and not playing to your strengths. If you have that ability to get to the basket, don't go out there and just hoist jump shots. And even if you make a couple, college coaches have been doing this for a long time. They understand what fool's gold is, and they understand what your strengths are. So play to those strengths. Number 2, worry about what you can control. And what I say there is you need to focus on the things within the game, be in the moment. And it's easy in July with all that's going on when you look at scouting services, media, college coaches, just the allure of some of the big tournaments, especially if they're sneaker tournaments, and there's so many distractions. And then you can let those distractions hurt you on the court, whether it's something like the way the official is calling the game, whether it's if you're in a back gym and the court's not very good and you're slipping, or whether there's just any problem in the game, anything that can get you kind of off tilt emotionally. Don't worry about that. Worry about what you can control. So what are the things you can control? The things you can control are being a great teammate. The things you can control are playing your hardest and playing to win. And, you can't control if your shot goes in. You can't control, if your teammate makes an open shot when you make a great pass to him and, you think it should be an assist. Don't worry about all that. Just worry about what you could control, which, again, playing your hardest, being a good teammate, respecting the game, all that good stuff that sounds cliche but really comes together and is going to be one of the most important things that colleges are going to look at when they're recruiting you. And that goes to the next one, which is intangibles. And when we talk about intangibles, we want you to understand that somebody's always watching. So we just had an episode with Ohio State's Ryan Peden. It's going to come out a couple days before this episode, and you're going to hear him talk about how he wants to watch you as a player when you're struggling. He wants to watch you as a player when you're playing at your best. And in those 2 moments and in the moments in between, he's going to understand your game, and he's going to understand your intangibles as a teammate. He's going to understand how you react to adversity. And remember, the college coaches are trying to gauge this because it all gets amplified to a greater extent when you get to college. So if you're being recruited at a level, like a high major level, like in Ohio State, and you act up and act a fool every time you don't get a foul call, well, they think, well, how's this kid going to react in front of 20,000 people on the road at Michigan or at Indiana when the same thing happens? He's going to be an asshole about it, so I'm not going to recruit that kid. So remember, someone's always watching, whether you're walking around the gym, whether you're on the bench, whether you're in the game. dealing with officials, dealing with your coaches, dealing with your parents. Someone is always watching you.
Just your body language.
Your body language.
I think body language is one of the biggest things is, you can watch guys, like you said, you miss a couple shots or you have something, you're moping back the floor. That college coach can see that you're moping back the floor and he's like, how's he going to handle 2 minutes to go you're playing for a Big Ten title and, he's moping back the floor. He's frustrated about something so simple like that. You got to just keep playing through your game. And like Corey said, playing through your strengths. If you can get back to, doing what you do best, that'll keep you going. Even if you're not playing well, your body language should always portray that, and you always keep going.
Absolutely. And you speak to a great point, which is, when I have conversations with college coaches about kids who I've seen that maybe they've only seen once or maybe they are interested in seeing but haven't seen yet, those are the type of questions they're going to ask me. Is, does the kid play hard? Does he have a good attitude? Is he coachable? Can he learn to play within our system of play, whatever that might be? And all of those are judged based on what my perception of your body language is, as well as those colleges. And, again, it speaks to really the number one question. This is a little bit off subject, but it's, do you love basketball? And that's the number one thing you hear from guys who are scouting for college, guys who are eventually scouting for the pros, NBA or overseas, is you got to love basketball. And if you don't, I think it's one of the most misjudged questions in basketball. Because if you don't love basketball, there's nothing wrong with that. And I remember we had a kid AAU last year, and we had lost a game, and I was telling my kids after the game, I said, well, how many of you want to play college basketball? My point was going to be, when I was expecting them to all raise their hands, and my point was going to be, well, if that's your goal, then you need to take some things more seriously. And we were going to talk about some of those things. But I had one kid not raise his hand, and I said, all right, let's have this conversation. Do you love basketball? And he said, well, yeah, I do, but it's not what I want to do. I said, well, what do you want to do? So I want to own my own business. Okay. So what do we do then? We use basketball as a tool. This is a kid who doesn't come from a lot of financial resources. We use basketball as a tool to get to college, and then we use that tool not so the system uses us, we use the system to get a free education. So if you don't love basketball, I don't think it's fair. I don't want kids to think that the college coaches are branding them as bad kids, but you need to understand how to use that as a tool. And if you do love basketball, you embrace that grind and what it takes to do college basketball day in and day out, whether it's 6 a.m. weights, whether it's 6 a.m. shooting, studying late at night, all that good stuff that goes with it, the travel. Let that show in your play. And you can let that show in your play with emotion. Don't be afraid to show emotion. If anything, college coaches are going to like that. They understand that it's a long month. And if you come with energy throughout those 15 days, believe me, it's going to be appreciated.
And I think there was in the Corey Evans podcast a week ago, he mentioned a kid, I think who's now at Florida, they're playing in a championship game. It's the last week of July, and everybody's just basically ready to go home. And he loses the game, and he's mad and unbelievably mad. That college coaches see that. They see that you have passion for the game, and that nobody may remember who won the 2015 whatever AAU tournament, but to remember that you had the passion, that all you wanted to do was win and help your team win. College coaches are definitely going to remember that. Absolutely.
And the last thing I want to say to players is this, and it's important to remember, and it's that you're extremely blessed. Whether if you want to be a Division I player, whether you get to that level or you don't get to that level, it's irrelevant if you do your best to try to reach that goal. And there's nothing wrong with playing on a small level. But remember, you're blessed. Whatever you have in your life that is difficult. One of the things, I've worked in AAU. I've coached some kids who don't come from a whole lot. And what I always try and tell them is, for every kid that's growing up in a similar situation like you, whether you have family problems, money problems, academic problems, whatever, there's 100 kids who are just like you who don't have basketball talent. So remember that you're blessed, have fun, enjoy the moment, and appreciate what you're given, and be thankful to those around you who support you. Next, let's talk about parents. And for parents, the July period is a emotional roller coaster, and it should be. You're talking about literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of tuition potentially changing hands. And is this thing a business? Absolutely. So what is our advice to parents having been in this for a decade? My number one is relax. Stay even keeled. And I say stay even keeled because if your son is going to be playing for 15 days on the road, he's probably going to play 30 plus games. In those 30 games, he's going to have a game where he plays terrible. He's going to have a game where he plays near perfect. And he's going to have a whole lot in between. And your son needs you to be that support system, not whether he played well or played horrible, but every single game. And remember that your son is going to be feeling the pressure much more so than you are as a parent. As a young man, he's going to have a harder time processing all the emotions that go with July. And parents in today's AAU game get a bad rap for being too involved, for going at high school coaches, for being difficult to deal with in the recruiting process. And for those who are listening to this, I think the best advice you can have is just to relax, enjoy watching your son play, and let the rest take care of itself. And again, just like we talked about with the kids, with worry about what you can control, same thing with you guys. And, I think I get a lot of calls, texts, emails from parents, and I think the best ones that I get are guys who come at me, whether it's a mother, a father, an uncle, or just a coach of a kid whose parents aren't, really involved in the basketball aspect of that kid's life, is looking at positively what are your son's strengths, what are the realistic goals for him, and then worry about your son. It's tough for me when I get emails asking me, well, how does my son compare to this kid? Or if I get a question from a parent saying, well, school X just offered player Y, and why haven't they offered my son? And those, I don't mind having those conversations, especially with parents I have a relationship with. But I think, again, worry about what you can control. Worry about cheering for your son's team, for all the kids on that team. And then after the game, helping your son just understand the big picture of basketball. And again, so we talked about with the kids, understanding that they're blessed to, have a chance to do this. And, worst case scenario, you have a bad month and you use it as a learning experience and you go back and work on your game and come back stronger in the winter. And that's my last thing, is use this as a learning experience. Understand that there's resources. I hope I can be one for anybody I know. I'm happy to talk to somebody who I haven't met before. And there's AAU coaches, there's high school coaches, there's event directors. When you're allowed to talk to college coaches, there's college coaches. Ask questions, understand that people have been in this position before, and understand that they want to help you through the process. There's very few people trying to take advantage of you and much higher quantity of people trying to help you. So don't be afraid to ask questions. The last thing I want to talk about is college coaches. So, I'm not in the business of telling these college coaches how to do their job, but I'm going to share some things that I've noticed over the years and how they apply to July. So the first thing I think is intangibles. And this is something that everybody talks about, but it gets real easy to overlook when you're staring in the face of talent. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody. And why am I guilty of that? Is because I don't have to deal with the kid every day. I'm a scouting talent, and if the kid's difficult to deal with, that ultimately doesn't become my problem. But we talked with Cincinnati Moehlers head coach Carl Kramer a couple weeks ago. What was the quote? Something about don't bend on your culture.
Yeah, don't bend on.
Don't bend on your culture. So whatever your culture is, stick to that culture. Stick to those intangibles and really recruit that. And again, it's something that everybody talks about, but do you really, really embrace it? The second thing is look for things that translate. Whatever your system is, if you want to be a team that really shoots the ball, if you want to be a team that really rebounds the ball and has physical bigs versus, longer, skinnier, skilled bigs, find things that translate. Find players' niches. Everyone we've had on this podcast, whether it be a college coach or a scout, we've talked about what translates in terms of, not just in terms of effort, but in terms of, is the kid have a legitimate skill set? Is the kid able to defend different positions? And look for kids that can do that and take that into your evaluations. Everything that we try and look at in terms of scouts is about finding a fit for the next level, and then recognizing that you guys have to find a fit for what your system is. And that fit isn't just that we can get a kid. That's a lazy way to recruit. The way to recruit is we can get this kid and we really, really want this kid. Some other kind of things that I jotted down are plan your day. I see a lot of college coaches who are extremely technical and using grids, using just different documents to plan their day. I know when I go throughout my day, I always have 2 lines at every single time slot, and I'm going to have the line for the game that I want to see and then the line for the secondary game, if that game is canceled, if that game's running way behind, if that game ends up being a 50-point blowout and I can't get anything about that game, if the kid I want to see gets hurt. So plan your day, make it as organized as possible, plan your commute. Sometimes I look at my sheets and they look stupid where I might be going to games in Cincinnati where I know the streets, but I still have all the addresses written out at the bottom of my paper, and that's just so I know that I'm prepared and can get through the day without any problems. The next one, I'm as guilty as anybody of this one, but I've talked to many scouts about it and college coaches, and everybody seems to think this is one of the problems right now in recruiting, and that is no cell phone. So my goal in July when I'm evaluating games is to try and stay off of my cell phone as much as possible. I take all of my notes on the computer, handwritten. I know most of you guys in college coaches, only watching a couple kids in the game, don't necessarily even need to write anything down from game to game. You can do it in between games if you do it at all. So trying to stay off your phone. Another one that I run into is avoiding conversations. There are some guys in basketball who I love. I always tell people TJ Kelly is one of my best friends in the entire world. Hate sitting next to him during a basketball game because I can't watch the damn game because we end up talking about some bullshit. So that's my goal for July, is to try and focus on the moment and stay away from the temptation of the phone and conversation that's off topic. And the last thing is just evaluations, quality versus quantity. And, my recommendation to you guys is to focus on quality evaluations, being spending more time watching individual kids instead of watching a young team and trying to focus on watching all 5 kids that are on the court. Pick out a couple guys, follow them, whether they're on the sneaker circuit, whether it's a sleeper, kid you've seen a little bit, a kid you've never seen. Really focus on quality of evaluation versus quantity. So that is my preview for July, talking about players, talking about parents, talking about college coaches, what to expect from the month, and my recommendations on how to handle this whole process.
And here, real quick, after the break, we're going to have a couple Twitter questions that we did have submitted.
This episode of the Triple Double Podcast is brought to you by Anago Cleaning Systems. For all of your commercial janitorial needs, call us at 513-332-0033. Anago is proud to be servicing Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, Greater Dayton, and Greater Columbus markets. Again, call us at 513-332-0033. You might even have me answer the phone, Corey Albertson, but probably not. Twitter is the one technological thing that I can do, folks. So I can't do anything with the podcast, but I can handle a tweet.
Yes, so. It is triple. It's at triple double at triple dub pod.
Triple dub pod.
Yep.
So all right, cool. Well, let's jump into a question that we got on Twitter, and like Jason said, we thank anybody that submits us questions on Twitter. You can also do it on Facebook. You can do it on email. You can do it in person. Ask somebody for my number. Never a problem. Happy to have these conversations. One of the big reasons why we started this podcast. So, Twitter handle Irvin SM asked me today about, first of all, thank you for listening to the show. And he asked me again today about how do you go about picking an AAU team for your son? And he asked me, programs to avoid, programs to gravitate towards, and I'm going to try and answer that real quick. So I'm gonna start that off with a little bit of asterisk, which is I don't know this individual in person, I don't believe, or at least I couldn't tell by their Twitter handle. So if I do, I apologize, but I don't know who your son is or sons. I don't know what level of player they are. So I'm going to go off of just some generic experience in Greater Cincinnati, Dayton, Northern Kentucky, and trying to answer that question. I think the important thing here is understanding the big picture, and there's no right or wrong answer. And I'm going to start with a couple specifics. So I started off coaching AAU coaching with Shining Stars, and Shining Stars is known in Cincinnati, especially since I started with them in 2008. And in 2008, Mike Price had just joined on relatively recently, and Mike really enhanced the Shining Stars brand. And Shining Stars was known for getting a lot of the suburban kids, a lot of the Catholic League kids, a lot of the, for lack of a better term, the white kids, and everybody thinks that a lot of the Shining Star kids have money. And, there's some truth to that, and there's some parts of that aren't true at all. But the reason I mention that is, on the flip side, after I left coaching the Shining Stars, I went to coach with the Queen City Profits. And when you look at the kids that play for the Profits, the vast, vast majority of them are inner city kids. There's a lot of kids who are rough around the edges who need the support structure of what the Profits program does. And it's very public that the Profits president, Ozzie Davis, and I have had our personal differences on how we view some things, but I'll say this about Ozzie, which is he saved a lot of lives. And Ozzie saved a lot of lives by helping a lot of kids who it was about more than basketball. And he's helped those kids to become grown men who have purpose, who are good fathers, who are good sons, who use the game of basketball as a tool. And in selecting an AAU program, those kids were much, much better off with the Profits than they were with maybe a Shining Star, where their kids tend to be, it's more of your parents take you on the trip, you stay with your parents, as opposed to the Profits thing where it's really a community thing. And that's not a knock on Shining Star. It's not a knock on the Profits. It's just a understanding what your goals are for your son, who your son is. In terms of basketball, some of the things that I wrote down here are, know your son's strengths and weaknesses. So you need to find a system, a coach that's going to make your son look good. And it's your son's obligation to perform, but you also want to find somebody that fits him. So if my son is a good big kid, what do I want to do with him? Well, I want to put him with a coach who's got some experience in developing and can help work with him. But I'm going to get to that part in a minute about skill development. But what I really want is find a roster with some guards who are quality guards that can get my son to basketball, who my son can outlet it to when I get the rebound, and then find a coach who's going to teach that type of basketball. So understand your son's strengths and weaknesses, find a role for him, and then be very honest and realistic in looking at the big picture of a team. Is my son, how many minutes is my son going to get on this team? Is he a starter? Is he a rotation guy? Is he a deep bench guy? And whatever the answer is, there's no right or wrong answer. But again, it's what fits you the best. The next thing is finances. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Do you drive? Do you go on the road trips? Are you able to, put some money in your son's pocket when they go on the road for some meals? I mean, all of these things are based on different programs. You're going to get different answers for how much they charge, what's included, what's not, what their schedule is, how intensive it is, how often you have to get your son to practice, all of these things. And these are questions you need to ask before you go out. Next is, how organized are they? When you're looking at an AAU program for your son, one of the main things you want to look at is how organized they are in terms of, are they presenting information properly? So one of the first things I would do is if you have any contact with a scout, any contact with a college coach, ask that scout or college coach, hey, in the media packets that they give out to college coaches and scouts at these AAU tournaments, is your team's roster in there submitted correctly with accurate jersey numbers? Is your team organized in terms of letting people know, when the games are, when the parents need to have the kids there by, what colleges have contacted them, et cetera, et cetera. Organization, and something we all struggle with. I'm in the AAU game. I struggle with this sometimes, and with the time constraints and nobody really doing this full time, it's difficult, but it's a critical piece, and it's something that parents need to evaluate. Skill development. I think skill development in terms of AAU teams is extremely overrated. And most people are going to tell you that it's underrated, it's the most important thing. And my take on that is the exact opposite. And it's because of this. I look at AAU as, if I'm going to have my team of mostly kids from within a 50-mile radius, probably less than that, but I got a couple kids from Dayton usually, and then maybe be about 50 miles away. We're going to have them in practice twice a week for a total of 4 hours, sometimes less. And how many weeks are we really going to have that for? 8, maybe? So how much time are we going to be able to put on skill development? Not that much. And we're going to work on putting in, the defensive system we want to have, the offensive system, letting the kids kind of gel together and everything. And we're going to do some skill stuff, but it's very easy to blame the AAU coaches for a player's lack of skill set. But understand that they're with that guy that coach so little. And maybe they train with them outside of AAU, and that's a separate topic. But your training is going to be after school. And the guys who I think are successful in my AAU team are the guys who, after school, they go in the gym, they get their shots up, they get their workout in, they get their lift in, and then they come to AAU practice and work on our team stuff. So while skill development is obviously an important part of basketball, I don't think that a AAU coach's ability to teach skill set to one kid on an individual basis is a deal breaker on the AAU circuit, even though some people will portray it as a huge thing. And then the last thing, experience with colleges. And we talked about this in our July preview. You want to be around an AAU program who has experience in sending kids to college campuses. And one of the things that I run into a lot in Cincinnati especially, and all over Ohio, but this one I think is bigger in Cincinnati than maybe Cleveland a little bit than anywhere else, which is there's a lot of teams that go to some of these big tournaments and they tell me, well, we're playing the same schedule as Ohio Red minus the Nike EYBL. But we're playing a similar schedule to them in terms of we're going to the Spieth Run and Slam. Maybe we're going to Orlando for Nationals. We're going to Vegas at the end of the summer like OBC. So we're going to get the same exposure. Not true. The exposure is really a relationship thing. And if you've listened to a lot of this podcast, you've heard people say how important relationships are. So whether it's a shoe circuit, whether it's just playing in some smaller tournaments, you want to deal with a guy who can get colleges to your games, who can then have that conversation with that college coach and say, hey, this kid might be a good fit. And if he is, let's figure out a way to get him to campus for a visit. And then from there, it's on the kid and the family to take it to the next step, not the AAU coach. But understanding that is a huge part of the game. And there's a lot of guys who look at smoke and mirrors, who kind of fool themselves into thinking that they're getting exposure when they're not. If you are never having guys at your games, but you're playing in a big tournament, and then you go play one of the Super Pool teams and they beat you by 50, and there's, John Calipari and Coach K there, they're probably not there watching your son. They're there watching the kid from the other team. And that's fine. But understanding, how do I get with an AAU coach who has experience in dealing with college coaches at all levels? So the last thing here I wanted to talk about are, you asked, again, at Irvin SM on Twitter, you asked what would be a good program. And obviously, I'm going to be biased towards who I'm currently with, which is the Cincinnati Lakers. I think there's other good programs in Cincinnati. I said there's merits to the Queen City Profits. There's merits to the Shining Stars, especially if you're playing for Mike Price's Shining Star team. There's merits to other things. There's merits to playing on a shoe circuit team and non-local team. I've said this on the podcast before, and eventually we'll get around to doing a whole episode on this, which is I think Cincinnati has the worst AAU culture in the United States of America, certainly in the Midwest. And because of that, your question is so relevant in that there's no one answer where you can join a program at a 6th grade or a 7th grade and rise all the way through to the 12th grade and have a great exposure opportunity. And then the last thing is, what about mom and pops? And the mom and pop teams is, that's a term that I use for it. But, these teams you see only have one team for one age group to come up. And, those teams generally don't get the exposure they deserve, even though they have players. So the final answer to your question, Irvin, is that there is no right answer. But hopefully you can look at your son's game. You can look at the finances, the organization of the program, the coaching, the experience, and in terms of alumni, how have they interacted with these college coaches, and you can make the right decision for your son.
We have one other question by Coach Verdell Billingsley from Ohio.
Oh, yeah. I like Verdell.
He has actually two questions, but the first one you just brought up, he said, what makes each city in the state of Ohio unique when it comes to basketball culture, like you said with Cincinnati?
Sure. So what makes each city different? I've said this before on the podcast. I think Columbus has by far the best basketball culture in Ohio. And I think you look at the city of Columbus and you look at the demographic, there's a little more resources there. There's a little more togetherness there. I see a better culture of parents being able to really develop relationships with other families and help each other. And there's a lot of politicking in Columbus, which I think you don't see in other places. But I think there's a great basketball community in Columbus where the resources are there, the tools are there to be successful if you follow the pattern. And I don't see that in other places. Cleveland, I think, has the best culture in Ohio in terms of the kids wanting to work together. And there's really, I see a pattern in Cleveland, and I shouldn't say Cleveland, I say Northeast Ohio, of the kids want to work together. They're really, really happy for each other when one kid does well, gets exposure, gets college offers and whatnot. And I think that's exciting. Their culture in terms of AAU it changes a lot. But there's a lot of talent in Cleveland. It's cyclical talent, and Cleveland was just very hot for a couple classes, and maybe now it's starting to go down more towards norm. But it's a culture with a lot of love for the game of basketball. Toledo and Dayton I'm going to group together because they're smaller cities, and those are chip on your shoulder cities. They're cities where basketball means a lot more. Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, there's so much emphasis on football. There's so much emphasis on pro sports. Toledo and Dayton have a lot of great culture with basketball, high school basketball, kids loving it. They're smaller communities, so if you're in those cities, I really recommend embracing that community. For example, if you're in Toledo, being around guys like Verdell, who asked this question, being around Coach Glaze, Coach Tuck, all those guys, trying to really develop relationships with everybody in that community is crucial, because I'm a big believer in that if you can get the best kids from a community to play together on the circuit level, it increases each individual kid's chance to get great exposure to colleges. And the last one is Cincinnati. And obviously I look at this through a biased eye because I know it's so much better than the other ones. I see the pros and the cons, and I've seen the cyclical nature of the talent and a dip for a while, and I think it's starting to come back here. But Cincinnati is a very difficult basketball culture in that the adults don't get along, and it lends itself to not having great success in getting kids to college that a Columbus has, because the resources are so much better in Columbus, where the adults don't get in each other's way. And like I said, eventually we'll do a whole episode on some of my thoughts on that. I've got some guests. I want to do kind of a more roundtable thing with that. So I know I jumped around a little bit, but Verdell, that's to answer your question. Always good to hear from you, brother. Wish you guys good luck in July. Thank you for your question. Oh, you had a second part?
Yeah, the other question was basically kind of teeing off that last point about the people getting along, but how can parents also hurt their students' recruitment? Yeah, that's a great question, and it goes back to what we talked about. I think the number one thing that parents can hurt their kids' recruitment is by not listening to every single coach and appreciating every coach that shows interest in your son. And unless you have offers from, Ohio State, Cincinnati, and Xavier, then you should never be turning down a mid-major school that offers your son. Same example with, unless you have every single offer in the MAC, you shouldn't be turning down Division IIs. And I'm a big believer in looking at a kid's recruitment. Let's say that we think this kid is a Division I player, mid-major Division I player. Let's start off by introducing this kid's game as a sophomore maybe to a Division II program. And those guys go, oh, yeah, we really like him. We're going to offer him a scholarship. Okay. And then we can move up and say, well, MAC schools, hey, we want you to get this kid on the radar. And they put him on the radar, and then a year later, maybe they offer him. So never say no to an opportunity. You never know who that coach knows. Word spreads fast. And, just being labeled as someone who's difficult to deal with, someone who college coaches feel like plays both sides against each other, someone who has an agenda outside of their own son, which is maybe hating on other kids or families, it can do huge, huge things to hurt your son's recruitment. And it's a thing that once it's gone, you can't get it back. And we've seen it many times with kids who are still available in the late signing period when they kind of nixed those offers that they had in the early signing period in the fall because they thought they were better. And then by the time the spring rolls around, some of the schools don't want to mess with them because they've been labeled as difficult to deal with, and these schools are going for out-of-state kids. And you'll hear these parents or these coaches telling all the media scouts that, my son's being hated on, my son's being slept on, this and that. But in reality, it's usually a situation that they created for themselves. And, we need to all look in the mirror and make sure that we're conducting ourselves professionally, understanding that, yes, this is a business for these college coaches, and it's also a business for you, because
if your son does not get recruited, you probably still want him to go to college, and that's going to be a huge financial burden. So it's a family thing. Obviously, you love your son, but it becomes financially driven very, very quickly. And you're asking for your son to, put up a lot of money. That's one thing I used to tell my AU team, which is, if everybody's tuition is going to be over $100,000 to go to college, that means that every time we step on the court as a team, we're playing for over $1 million in tuition money. So think about that. Every time you play an AU game, there is over $1 million in tuition money on the line. And one kid's going to get it, whether it's your kid, whether it's another kid on the other team, because you didn't do your part. Understand that, understand the stakes, and be as informed as you can. Are those all our questions?
Those are all our questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the guys who submitted questions. Really enjoyed doing this. A little bit different episode for us without a guest. Enjoy the live period for those who are on the road. Hopefully you're driving down the highway listening to this, and we'll be back at you soon with some more episodes. For Jason Morrow, our producer from 270 Hoops, my name is Corey Albertson from Triple Double Prospects, and you listen to the Triple Double Podcast. Thank you.